Jablonski, and I will be your session organizer for today. Today's topic is Best Practices for Managing Board Governance, presented by Elizabeth Dorico, Associate Executive Director of Strategic Member Engagement at the New York State Bar Association. Before I turn it over to our presenter, I have a few housekeeping items that I'd like to mention. In the right corner of your screen, you will see a small orange or gray box with a white arrow inside. Please click on this box to open your control panel. I'd like to do a quick check to make sure everyone can see my screen and hear me clearly. On the control panel, you will see a button with a small yellow or white hand in it. Please click on this button to raise your hand to confirm that you can see me and hear me and see my screen clearly. Let's go ahead and do this now. Great, I see lots of hands raised. Thank you. Also within the control panel, you will see a questions box. We are recording this session and everyone's line has been muted for the ease of this presentation, but you may still ask questions. Please use the questions box to send questions to our presenter throughout the presentation. Our presenter has saved some time at the end of our session and will answer your questions then. To ask a question, simply type in the questions box and hit send. I'd like to test this now as well. Please type hello in your questions box. Okay, great. Lots of hellos. Thank you. I think we can get started now. We hope that you enjoyed today's session. I will now turn it over to our presenter by sharing her screen. Elizabeth, I'm going to go ahead and do that now. And I'm going to go ahead and unmute your audio as well. When you're finished with your presentation, please let me know so I can share my screen again. You may begin.
Good afternoon, everybody. I am your governance elf for the day, and how I've described this will become clear as we go through the presentation. I have chosen a holiday theme for today's presentation as your governance elf. So some of our seasonal wishes are to have a white Christmas. For those of us who are experienced unseasonably warm weather, this is certainly the case. Not too much, just enough. Some of us, including some of my colleagues here at the New York State Bar Association, are hopeful for a beach-laden Christmas with some time in the sun. Others are hoping for Hanukkah gelt. Others are hoping for some peace and quiet. So one of the things we're going to do today is we're going to talk about some of the big stuff. And my holiday wish of the big stuff is governance, and to have an engaged governance board. And so what do we know about good functioning boards? And this presentation also applies to committees. How are our committees functioning, and how are our committee members contributing? So for those of you who don't necessarily deal with the board but deal with a section executive council or deal with committees on an ongoing basis, many of the same precepts we're going to talk about today in terms of good governance also apply to you. So what do we want from our members as staff people and as stewards of the association? We want our members to be prepared. We want them to ask thoughtful questions. We want them to be engaged in the process. We want them to be open to possibilities, both about charting the future of the profession as well as charting the work of their committee, section, or other entity. We want them to have a wow experience. We want them not to be distracted by superfluous information and by superfluous issues. And what are some of the ways that we can do that? Today we're going to shed some light on the subject by exploring some of the bigger issues involved in preparing board members or committee members for their role, as well as looking at what the possibilities are for some very practical tips that have been shared for making this happen. I want to thank in advance all of the people who made a contribution to this presentation. This was a crowdsourced presentation. My NABE colleagues were instrumental in giving me good feedback about what works or what some of their perplexing challenges are in their own boards, as well as my colleagues here at the New York State Bar Association, who gave me some very thoughtful responses about their experience in dealing with governance at the section committee, board, and House of Delegates level. So often we're going to start big, and we often make assumptions about what our board members know, what our committee members know, and what their own expectations are of governance. And so one of the ways we can all be on the same page and singing from the same song and understand the notes that are being played is by creating some shared expectations. And by creating shared expectations, we create a sense of how our service is going to contribute to the organization, contribute to the work of the committee, contribute to the work of the section. And because each board is different, our board members often come with other kind of experience. If we're a state bar, they might have come from a local bar board. If we're a local bar, they may have come from a specialty or diversity bar. And so each of those board experience and the expectations about how the board works can be very different. And it can be very different if you're used to working on a philanthropic board, or you're trying to move from a governing board to a working board, or from a working board to a governing board. So there are different nuances to how this can work. And so we want to be prepared to be able to understand what brought the board member there and what their prior experience is. This is going to save us a lot of work in the long run, I think. So how do we do this? We want to tap into their energy. We want to tap into what brought them to the board, because people come to the board with very different experiences and very different expectations. So finding out why they're there will help you as the staff member or the executive director. So at the first committee meeting or the first board meeting, absent a formal orientation process, and while I would recommend a formal orientation process, I think they go a long way to creating camaraderie and shared understanding. At least have members share their articulated expectations about why they want to be on the membership committee, why do they want to be on the CLE committee, why do they want to be on the board, understanding what motivated them beyond it's a good idea. So they can meet as a class, and they can have that shared experience about why they're all there, and that's going to create some camaraderie and, again, some shared understanding about how this board operates. Do we get fed? When do we get the materials? How do we get the materials? Do we have protocols for debates? Those are very important factors that people are often reluctant to ask, but that we can clarify up front by not making any assumptions about what they know about this board experience. So this is going to lay the groundwork for some better practices going forward. And by having the board or the committee identify what good practices they want to incorporate, they are much more likely to adhere to those guidelines if they've helped create those and have developed those shared expectations. Another factor in good governance is to be prepared. And by being prepared, we're talking about plans. And having a good strategic plan, having a good operational plan will really help frame the board's work for the coming year, or the committee's work for the coming year. If we know what our budget cycle is, if we can let members know what typically is the pattern and the calendar for our upcoming board meetings. In June, we consider the budget. In April, we consider nominations. In November, we decide certain kinds of awards. That will help frame what's going to happen at the board level, as well as having a strategic plan to work from that gives the board a framework for some of its decision making. So we want to help our board members not get run over by the reindeer, and we want to help ourselves and our staff to be prepared not only for the meeting, but the year ahead and what the governance year ahead looks like. We have to make decisions about dues at this date. And so laying that all out up front helps members have a framework for where their decision making is going to be. One of the centerpieces in my mind of good governance practices is focusing on the agenda. As far as I'm concerned, the agenda is the center of our governance universe. And that is the framework for which we both make decisions about the future of our organization, as well as how we contemplate what the challenges are ahead. So the agenda is really a key component, and you should begin planning the next agenda for your committee meeting, for your board meeting, your House of Delegates meeting, immediately after the prior meeting. And what goes into thinking about that agenda is a collaborative effort, it seems to me, with obviously your officers and those to whom report to the board. What are the issues that are going to be on our plate? What kinds of rules may be coming down that we may have to consider? And I think you can use the agenda as a tool and a framework to implement both your strategic plan and your operational plan and provide some framework for those discussions. How things get debated and how much information we send is always an issue. And I'm going to talk about the components of what a successful agenda may look like and some particular ways in which you may frame that agenda to get the best decision making possible. So a good agenda should include a consent agenda, and I know not every board uses a consent agenda, but a consent agenda can be particularly useful. In a consent agenda, you would put things that are accepted and non-debatable. Under Robert's Rules of Order, any member of the governing body can remove an item from the consent agenda, but this will give you more time for the meatier objects on the things that are of greater focus on your agenda by putting items on the consent agenda, such as accept the report of the membership committee, or to accept the report of a particular committee, a particular staff member, or a particular entity that doesn't require action. And so sometimes approval of the minutes is on the consent agenda, and those items are accepted by the board and approved as a whole. And as I mentioned earlier, any member can ask that an item be removed from the consent agenda and be debated separately. Good agendas, I think, are timed agendas. Now, my experience here at the New York State Bar Association has said that timing an agenda does not always mean that the board stays on time. Our board meets 4 times a year in person, and then they meet by conference call in addition when there is a matter that requires more immediate attention. We do time out our agendas, and so some items may get a half hour, some items may get 15 minutes. But at least you have framed the debate by timing it out and giving some sense of start to finish to the meeting, and I think that's really helpful to have a guidepost for both the board members and whoever the presiding officer is, including the committee chair who may be running a particular meeting. So if there is an item on the agenda that is particular for debate, you might want to include on the agenda who will be speaking to or presenting on that particular issue. Who is the board member that will present as the liaison to the membership committee because you are talking about a special dues offer to legal services attorneys, and they're going to make that motion? Is it the chair of the membership committee? Who's the person that's going to present? I would like to know that as a board member in advance. If I have any questions on the report, It might help me prepare to know who the presenter is going to be. It may be useful information for me to have. The additional item I would include on an agenda is what action do you want me as a board member to take? Is this report going to be informational? Is it going to be a discussion item in advance of taking action later on? At our most recent meeting of our executive committee and our House of Delegates, we had several informational reports, and those reports were presented in preparation for final disposition by our executive committee and our House of Delegates at our January meeting. These are massive reports with a lot of recommendations. And so because of the nature of those reports and the extensive impact that these reports will have, it was really helpful for our executive committee, our House of Delegates, to be able to ask questions and give some input so that the committee in the final drafting before submitting for final approval could take those matters into account. And it can be, and it's done in an open forum and the questions are raised. So is the report informational, and will there be at some point further action? You might want to note that on the agenda. Is this to approve the report? And then what's going to happen to the report? Is the report going to the chief judge? Is it going to be sent to an outside entity? How is it going to be implemented as policy of the association? What's the next step? It's helpful to note that on the agenda as well. Is it a report that is just going to be accepted, that it doesn't become part of the policy, but we've accepted the report as the governing body, and thank you for your work. So I think that's a very helpful piece of information to have as a board member. So as detailed as you can make your written agenda, the more helpful it is when board members are going through the materials that they're going to get in advance. Think of your agenda also as an opportunity, and that opportunity is to incorporate guest speakers, guest presenters. There is something I've called the curse of there's nothing on the agenda, which normally means when there's nothing on the agenda, there's going to be something that's late-breaking. If, however, you are not cursed with late-breaking matters that need to be dealt with, this is an opportunity to use your board meeting to have guest speakers, guest presenters. This was a best practice that was recommended by a number of you. It can be your chief judge. It can be your chief administrative judge. It might be the president of the Legal Aid Society. It might be one. There are lots of opportunities to bring someone in whose organization has an impact on your association and how it does business, to be able to help the board frame some of the issues and challenges. The same is true for a committee. If you have a committee that is dealing with rules of professional conduct, and you might want to have someone from the disciplinary authorities in your state, if they're not already represented on that committee. So there are lots of opportunities, both at the committee section and board level, to have some outside participation. What that also will do is help to engage your members and your committee members in the process. You're giving them something that feels good that they might not otherwise have gotten from their committee experience by having the opportunity to meet with that guest speaker. What if questions? So what if questions in my mind are, what if we no longer had an income stream from CLE? What if we no longer had, we were no longer charging for this particular program? What would the impact be? What if our state decided to rescind its mandatory rules of continuing legal education? You know, what if the law school, our local law school, reduced its class by 50%? And so what are some of those questions that can help us think about our contingencies? What, on the positive side, what if we got a windfall? What if we had the opportunity to buy the parking lot across the street? what would we do? And so that is going to engage the board in a way that is dynamic and creative and gives some sort of framework of, again, a shared experience, also helps the board think about opportunities in a different kind of way because they're not making decisions, but they are thinking about what the possibilities are rather than dealing with the day-to-day that's in front of them. If you don't already do so, I think liaison updates can be a very useful tool. And if your board members have assignments and they're representative of geographical areas or they're liaisons to other entities within the community, one of the ways to keep them on task is to rotate who reports at the board meeting and have a framework for those questions for those reports, and that can engage them and help them to serve their ambassadorial role on behalf of the organization and understand that they are the chief cheerleaders for our bar associations and help them make that connection back to membership and back to that role. And by having them report, it helps them do that. Creating space for revisiting the strategic plan is really a vital component of how we should conduct our board business. Where are we with our strategic plan? If we are the membership committee, if we're the CLE committee, if we're the committee on professional development, if we are the legislative committee, if we're the legislative steering committee, where are we with what our long-term plans are? How are we doing? How are we gauging what we may need to adjust or not? One of my colleagues recommended a steering committee on certain issues to provide continuity as a good practice. And I think legislative matters are a really helpful way to go. In our bar association, and I know in many state bars, your state legislative and federal legislative activities are key. By having a steering committee, you create some continuity there, and that steering committee can help direct the board because they're creating some continuity and some framework for how those matters that can be very controversial are considered. Mentioned this earlier, but who are your community partners in your organization and how are they interacting with your bar association, and what issues are they dealing with that may become the association's issues? By having guest speakers and by framing some of the larger issues in the context of a board meeting, again, you're giving the board members a unique experience, you're giving them an opportunity to engage differently, and you're helping them to go beyond the administrivia that often bogs down our boards and bogs down our discussions. I mean, we've all had that experience where something gets debated to death that in our minds seems rather mundane, where something that is a much larger issue and may have greater impact sort of sails through. And it's still a mystery to me why that sometimes happens, but it does. So in preparing for the board meeting and in developing the agenda, some best practices are do a dry run on controversial issues before the board meeting as you develop the agenda. Work with, whether it's a committee chair or the presiding officer, you know, what are some of the scenarios that could happen? If you have a House of Delegates and where you're debating big issues like changes to the rules of professional responsibility or, you know, overhauling the mandatory CLE rules, this can be particularly dicey, and so having a dry run isn't always going to prepare you for every contingency, but it may set up the framework for discussion. And again, if there's a controversial resolution that's coming down the pike, I know several years ago when bars were taking positions on marriage equality, there was controversy surrounding the appropriateness of that. You might want to talk about you might want to consider a scheduling resolution, which would set forth how many people could speak to the issue, how much time there was given to rebuttal, And when you have something that is controversial, it can streamline the process in making sure everyone gets heard, because that's the most important part. The decision, most people will abide by a decision, even in a controversial matter, if they feel that they've been heard. And by agreeing on upfront what the rules of engagement are with a scheduling resolution, you can begin to address some of those. Again, what are the rules of engagement? And some of those are how we conduct our board business, and you can set those forth in the beginning of the year. And how are we going to deal with this issue? Or who's going to be in the room when we have this debate? We know from all of the academic research about boards and how boards work, both for-profit boards and nonprofit boards and philanthropic boards, boards make better decisions when there's someone, as one of my colleagues said, who's willing to upset the apple cart and willing to ask tough questions. Oftentimes, we don't do that in the board context. We're really concerned about that, that there's not enough debate or there aren't enough questions. I'm going to talk a little bit later about the use of a staff memo that can be helpful in this regard. But also, do you have a professional devil's advocate or curmudgeon on your board? I have read about, and I know that there are 1 or 2 bar association boards that invite someone to play that role, to argue the opposite. We all have good lawyers on our boards. They should always be able to argue the opposite position. And if we designate someone at each board meeting who's going to play that role to foster a thorough examination and a good debate, to make sure we're looking at all sides of the issue, we will likely get better decision making. Another best practice that really helps the board engage in best practices for governance are big picture reports with trends. It's always tricky to know how much information the board wants. That's one of the questions that came up in preparing for this presentation. Is one of the executive directors said, I often wonder how much information is too much information. And we know on our boards there's the person who is the big picture guy who doesn't care about the details and who just doesn't want to be messed up even with the facts. He or she is just there to make a decision and tell me what I need to decide, and boom, I'll decide it. On the opposite end of the spectrum is the incredibly detail-oriented person who wants footnotes, who will have read everything very thoroughly, and if something says number 17 on page 2, and then there's a typo and it says number 18 on page 322 of the report, they will have picked that up. And they can really bog you down in saying, well, why is this different between this page and then page 322? We don't want to consume the board's time with that. And so that is really a tricky negotiation. I think we can say, well, gee, it was a typo. Sometimes that isn't good enough. And so we want to be really careful about giving them enough information that they can make an informed decision, and we work this out with whoever the submitter is without, again, bogging them down in details that gets the board members so in the weeds that they're not effective at their decision making, which is what the whole purpose is. So one of the ways around this is to create dashboards. The San Diego County Bar Association has a really nice dashboard. We are working on one here that I'm happy to share with someone when we finish building it. But we are looking at big picture numbers, like where is our membership now, where were we last year, how many unique members have come to a CLE program this year, how many unique members came to a CLE program last year, how many events have we hosted in our bar association this year, how many did we host last year. How many law school visits have we conducted this year? How many law school visits did we conduct last year? We're also looking to connect those numbers to impact in a way that's meaningful. Our section liaisons have found it very helpful to provide their section executive committees with trend information. So what does membership look like, not just this year, but across 5 years? Have there been ebbs and flows in membership? Where are our finances? So a snapshot of trends can be very helpful to the board in its decision making without bogging them down in every line item detail of the budget. Where are we? What do I need to know in order to make an informed decision going forward? And how do we do that, and how do we present that? Over the years, there's been some philosophy that says to just drown board members in detail and in paper, and then they'll get so bogged down they won't be able to see the forest through the trees. I think that that is a disservice to the board member. I think we need to give them information that is digestible and understandable, that helps them exercise their fiduciary responsibility to move the organization forward and to make very informed decisions. And that's a really key element of this. Executive director and other staff reports oftentimes are neglected, and I don't think that they should be. The key to what's going on administratively in the organization on a day-to-day basis should be captured in an executive director's report. That executive director's report should be written. It should be a companion piece to the dashboard. And if there is an opportunity for the executive director to report, and again, I would put that into a larger framework of not so much what the staff has done, but what are our next steps on behalf of the staff in thinking about big picture items. Where are we going? What are the kinds of things we're working on? So the board has a sense that we've got this complementary momentum to the work of the board in terms of how we're implementing. And again, updating the strategic plan on a regular basis within the context of the board meeting will also help with that report. I would avoid, certainly as an executive director or staff member reporting on behalf of an entity, of simply reading that report. One of the things that I referenced in terms of preparation and the agenda is a staff or a cover memo. We do staff memos that accompany all of the reports to be considered by our executive committee and our House of Delegates. I think whether you've got the capacity for the staff to do that as executive director, or your general counsel, or whoever is involved in helping shape the governance of your board, that can be very useful, or the staff member for the committee submitting the report to the board should be able to prepare a cover memo. If you don't have the staff to do that, then whoever is submitting the report should also, I would recommend, submit a cover memo. So some of the things you might want to include in terms of background in a staff or a cover memo. What was the vote of the committee, section, or entity that is referring the report to the board or the House of Delegates or the committee? Was it a subcommittee that is recommending this to the Committee on Standards of Representation of Immigrant Children, for example? So what was their vote in recommending this to the full board for their consideration? That's very helpful to know. A good board member is going to ask the question. So what were the committee's feelings on this? Was it unanimous? Were there dissenters on this committee? I would want to, and knowing that up front helps then, again, to frame the debate and frame the discussion so that we're helping our board make decisions with the most appropriate, up-to-date information that they need to be informed. Who had input into the report? I'm sure we've all had the experience where the committee comes with an incredibly well-crafted report. It reflects, a lot of work on behalf of the committee that is invested in pro bono, and it's recommending this policy. And for example, if you have a pro bono committee and they're all gung-ho and it's beautifully crafted and the motion is on the table to adopt the report of the pro bono committee that recommends X, Y, and Z, and then when it's open for debate, somebody raises their hand and says, well, this impacts committees B, C, and D. Has anyone talked to them? And the answer is no. And so when that is, so then typically what happens, that report or that issue gets pulled back, and now we have to go and we have to talk to those committees. So part of our role, I think, as staff and as liaisons is to say, to help our committees not work in isolation so that they connect the dots beforehand, before that report goes to the board, and so that we can make sure that all of those bases are covered. Now, sometimes we can't anticipate that someone else would have wanted to weigh in, and that's an opportunity for the board to say, yes, but, and that is part of the good debate. But, so in a good staff memo, here's who we asked. You know what? Real Property Committee weighed in on this, and they don't really care about this issue. We thought they did, but they really don't. But we did check with them, just so you know, and our bases are covered. Who was it circulated, to whom, and when? What are the pros and cons? This goes back to the notion of a curmudgeon. So in a staff memo, if there is potential opposition out there, if there is potential bad publicity, if there is a potential to upset a certain constituency by taking this position, if it's going to adversely impact the members, if it's going to have a financial impact that's adverse, or conversely, if there is an impact that's a real positive impact that may not have been considered in the context of the report or the recommendation, we might want to note that as well on the cover memo. We talked earlier about scheduling resolutions. You also, depending on the issue, may want to have a draft resolution. I have seen agendas where the draft motions are incorporated right into the agenda, or it may be incorporated into the staff memo. What happens is it makes it easier then when amendments are on the floor to have, or on the table, to have that draft motion to work from in order to further move the motion along. So that's something to consider. Again, I want to reiterate, run through the agenda with presiding officer and other presenters. Having a conference call or a brief meeting the week before when you're developing the agenda is not the worst idea in the world. One of the things I was questioned about in preparation and in preparing for this was, how do folks get out their agendas? And the most common practice is not by Santa sleigh. It is electronic. And it is also still done by mail. We do mail our reports in addition to sending them electronically. Accepted practice is electronic. One or two bar associations do have iPads available at their board meetings for their board members to pull up the agendas and use an iPad while on site. I believe one board did buy them for members, does buy iPads for members each year. It's part of their board service. They get the iPad as a gift and are able to access their agenda materials that way. Some people still like paper and like to write on them and are able to make those available. But the prevalent way that agendas are circulated is electronically. Most bars also reported having hard copies on site. So, what's reasonable for you and your organization? Sending it in advance is important. Most people send it at least a week in advance. Sometimes there are late-breaking reports that are distributed on site. Some bars have protocols for their board saying, unless it is a dire matter, we will not consider an item that comes in within a certain time, because the board will not have time to digest the issue and make an informed decision unless it's, on an emergency basis. Another thing I wanted to bring up that is something that we're doing We use higher logic. We have a community for our House of Delegates. We also have one for our Executive Committee. And you will see here how we have organized a group of members of the House of Delegates, and this is called the Reports Group. And this is where we put all the reports that will be scheduled for our House of Delegates meeting. And you can see here they're all PDFs. They're all available. A notice goes out when a new report is posted into the committee. And as those reports come in, that notice goes out and members can access the report. There also is an opportunity for members to discuss reports should they choose to do so. So far, no one has taken advantage of that particular feature in this community that we have created. But that is a possibility going forward, and I can see that happening where there might be some suggestions to a report going forward. And so, as you can see, all of our reports are listed there. The reports are restricted to the members of the House who are part of the House of Delegates group. There is no way, however, someone asked about limiting if reports are confidential, there would be nothing to prevent a member of the House from downloading the report as a PDF. So you do have to be aware of that in these community contexts. But I think in the future, the opportunity for some pre-meeting deliberation is going to increase, and collaboration as we roll out these kinds of communities and these kind of collaborative tools in our associations. So I wanted to show you what we're doing. So the agenda. So now we're at the meeting. We've developed this agenda. Everything is prepared. We put into place best practices. We have a staff memo. We have a timed agenda. We got our agendas out in advance. We have circulated our reports. We've invited our special guests to engage board members. Our liaisons are prepared with the reports, and now we're there. So what happens? How do we make the best use of this time? So several bars are doing this, which I think is a great idea. They're projecting the agenda on a screen or on monitors along with any motion. So, you know, some board member leaves the room to take a phone call, to use the restroom, to grab another cup of coffee, which is outside of the room, and they come back, and the question of where we are, because we've accepted the financial report and we're on to the next issue. And rather than whispering to the person sitting next to them, by having that agenda up on the screen, we've eliminated that. Everybody knows where we are. We've advanced, and the motion that's on the floor is also there. I don't care what size board you're working with, unless it's like 4 or 5 people. I think this is really helpful to have those slides ready in advance with the motions and with the agenda separated. I think that really helps focus, and it also adds another level of engagement because it's visual, and we can focus on that. And particularly if our financial report, we've got our budget is on a slide, and we've got some of our percentages, and our dashboard is on a slide. Everybody's looking at the same thing, and nobody's shuffling through their papers. And if they're looking at their iPad, everybody's seeing the same thing at the same time. Feed them. I'm surprised how many bars aren't feeding their board members. I think we need to feed them. I think we need to give them good coffee and good Danish and a good lunch. Ask, what are we missing? So in the context of our board meeting, if the meeting goes off the rails, or if there's something that doesn't feel right, if you've been through enough board meetings, you know, or enough committee meetings or enough section meetings, sometimes our gut tells us we're missing something here. And I think it's perfectly okay to say, what are we missing? Play dumb. Ask a question. Ask if someone who's been quiet, whisper to your providing officer, you know, Susan has been really quiet today. If they've been really quiet and they're not playing Words with Friends on their iPad, then it's likely they've been absorbing something and they're hesitant to say something, and you might want to suggest to the providing officer or just say, hey, can we take a break here for a minute? Can I ask a question? Susan, you've been really quiet. You haven't weighed in on this, and that may help open the floodgates to either more discussion or a really pertinent question that hasn't been raised. And I think we need to be trustful of our instincts as to when that's happening. I mean, for many of us who have observed board meetings or committee meetings and are really well versed in these subjects, we have to often remember that sometimes our board members aren't, or our committee members aren't as well versed as we are, particularly if we are long tenured. And so this may help focus on those questions where people are hesitant to ask the question. If you're concerned about time, ask for a timekeeper from the board. The great things about iPads and about iPhones and Android phones is they all have built-in timekeepers. And if you can set up the iPad and have someone be the timekeeper and the enforcer, if you're the executive director or you are the committee liaison, you might not be in the best position to do that, but if another staff person in the room or another member of the committee agrees to be a timekeeper to say, oh, we've got 20 minutes, and then you can flash the iPad, there's really no need for one of those elaborate timers, but we can do that, and we can agree upon that we're going to set the timer, and it's going to go off and play Chattanooga Choo Choo at the end of the 20 minutes of debate, and it helps keep everybody on schedule and on time. If things feel like you're not getting anywhere, an old facilitator's trick is to take a break, whether it's scheduled or not. Even if your board meeting is only scheduled for an hour and a half, say, you know what, whisper to the providing officer, prepare him or her in advance to say, hey, if this feels like it's going in the wrong direction and people are going off on a tangent, why don't we just pull it back and say, let's take a break? Having people get up, move around the room, go get another cup of coffee, use the restroom, maybe answer an email, may reset the debate. And so don't be afraid of doing that. If you're concerned about your presiding officer and how they're going to conduct a meeting, send them to BLI. That's my plug for BLI, because they will be able to attend a session on how to run an effective meeting. And we know that the ability to do that varies wildly among our officers. And so they need some prep and some help doing that. You know, there are some techniques to make sure that everybody feels heard, but doesn't make the meeting last for 6 hours. And so I think part of our role as staff members is to help our committee chairs and our presiding officers to stay on track. So after the meeting, good governance practices include sort of post-meeting work. And so we had a training program here yesterday, and we're doing one, I believe it's tomorrow, for all of our staff who are liaisons regarding minutes. And there is a lot of misunderstanding about Robert's Rules of Order and what minutes should reflect. Get the minutes out promptly. Minutes should reflect action, not discussion. And that's really important. We see a lot of minutes oftentimes that are transcripts of what happened and what the discussion was, as opposed to capturing what action took place. The motion was adopted. There are different ways in which to record those and to record people's names. Whatever's customary in your association should just be consistent across the board in terms of who is referenced. We, for example, don't include who made the motion, but other bars' minutes do reflect in the minutes who made the motion. So just make sure that across your governing entities, whether committees, sections, and the board that your minutes are consistent in style and format. We're trying to get to that point here. Our general counsel created a great guideline on minutes for us that I would be happy to share with anyone who would like that, that we've circulated to our staff. So even if you're as staff members, you're not taking the minutes, you want to make sure that the secretary of the committee who is taking the minutes is following the appropriate format. Robert's Rules of Order in this case is your friend. There's a great outline in Robert's Rules, The Idiot's Guide by Nancy Sylvester, that talks about the format of minutes and how to record them. And so I think that's really a key component of a good governance practice, is to have good minutes and to know where they are. Because they are the backbone of the association. The same thing would be true for bylaws. We want to know where our bylaws are. Some of our section liaisons recommended, and this is great practice too, is to keep a running tally of amendments and when they were adopted when. So not only do we have a red line version, but we have a historical record of when our bylaws were amended, and particularly if you have a lot of sections and you're keeping track of a lot of bylaws amendments, that's really important. And to have all your bylaws in one place, because they're referred to frequently, and if you have new staff, you want to be able to reference those. Checklists. After the meeting, what's the checklist? What's the to-do list? What's the follow-up action? Who wasn't at the meeting that needs to know what happened promptly? And I think in larger organizations with lots of staff, this is a particular issue. And so after the board meeting, boy, we're relieved. It's done. We're so happy. This was adopted. That was adopted. And, you know, there's relief all around. But who needs to know what action the board took? Is it a committee chair who wasn't there? What do we need to tell them, and who's going to do that? Is the president going to call the committee chair to say, you know what, your report was accepted, you know, it's great, now we're going to move forward with implementation? Is it you as the executive director? Is it the committee liaison who's going to go back to the committee chair and say, hey, you know, the executive committee, the board has sent this back, it needs more work? Who's going to make that call? Let's be clear when we leave the meeting or very soon after about what's going to happen. And I, as a key staff member relative to governance as the executive director, what other staff need to know this? Does this affect their committee? What decision was made on the budget that we need to know, and who's going to tell them? And I think we oftentimes forget what we need to tell other staff. At least I know that I am guilty of that, and you know, have as my New Year's resolution to do a better job of that. Finally, I debriefed the meeting. What went well about the board meeting? What could have gone differently? If, you know, we go through these a lot. You know, our presiding officers are only going to preside over, you know, maybe 12 meetings in their tenure as president. And so at those first couple of meetings, what could they help them figure out what they could have done better? What went really well? What did they do that knocked it out of the park? How did they shut down a debate that went off on a tangent? What technique did they use? So then we reinforce good behavior, and we can help them do the best job that they can, because that's what they want to be able to do. And I think if we view our role as facilitators and partners in helping them be successful, whether it's a committee chair or it's the president who's presiding over a board meeting, we've gone a long way in terms of doing that. One final thought is board evaluations. Good practice is to evaluate the board and have the board do self-evaluations. You can do this at the end of every meeting. I know some local bar boards do this. It may not be practical for time considerations, but maybe halfway through the year, say, you know, at the beginning of the year, we set out as a board to say this is how we wanted to be together. We wanted to make a difference. We wanted our board meetings to run smoothly. We wanted to have vigorous debate. We wanted to be open to new ideas, and we wanted our time to be well spent. how are we doing about this, and what mid-course corrections can we do to make this better? I know the Division for Bar Services has some examples of board evaluations, whether they're electronic or they're discussion questions. And finally, I want to leave you with, I want to know what your final thoughts are. Now is the time for airing of grievances because it's Festivus, and so I will take this opportunity to respond to any questions you might have. So if you'll use the chat box, I will see those questions come in.
Elizabeth,
thank you.
We have one
yes.
question that just came in from Patricia. She wants to know if you have any advice on dealing with past chairs who continue to serve on a committee after their leadership tenure has ended.
Well, yes. It is challenging. There's no question about it, to have past chairs. One is to work towards a policy that that limits participation, and I know it's harder in local bars than it is in state bars, but we want to make sure that we're giving everybody the opportunity to participate. And I think by positioning this as an opportunity to bring new blood in, we can help with that generational transition that will be taking place in all of our associations. I think the other piece is if we can give that person another task to engage them, so they're no longer maybe so involved in that committee, but they're going to be involved in something else, to give them an alternative way to contribute and look for other opportunities that may free them up a little bit from that committee. But that can be a real challenge when you have someone who has chaired the committee who then stays on the committee and is unwilling to relinquish that leadership role. I think that's, if they're not a past president, that's also the place where you can ask a past president to help make that conversation possible.
We have another question from Ellen. Ellen would like to know thoughts on what to do if board assessing their performance differently than the executive team.
Can you repeat the question, Rebecca?
Thoughts on what to do if the board is assessing their performance differently than the executive team, i.e. president and ED.
Oh, I mean, I think that's the time to have a real conversation with the board and to say, here's what our score. It's like doing a performance evaluate. When you do a performance evaluation and you have a team member self-evaluation and you have your evaluation as the manager, and they're wildly different, I think then you take out what are our expectations that are so different. And I think by focusing back on what our expectations are of each other, that can help frame that work if you have that expectations conversation. So why are these really different? Because probably they're different because our expectations are different about what it means to be on this board or what it means to deal with issues going forward. And so if we can get back on the same page by having a conversation around that relative to expectations, by not arguing about the ratings, but saying sort of why are the evaluations different, likely because our expectations are different, and then focus the conversation back on what are our shared expectations going forward of how the board functions or how our meetings function. I think that will help get us back on track.
I think we've got maybe a minute more for questions. I don't have anything that's coming right now, so if anyone has any additional questions, please use this opportunity to do that now. So type in your chat box, or you can also raise your hand and we will open your line to ask a question. I'm not seeing any more questions, so I think we can go ahead and wrap this up. Thank you for participating in today's session, and I also want to thank Elizabeth for presenting today. Please be watching your email for a message from us that will include a link to a short evaluation in addition to any session materials. We have also recorded this session, and we will be distributing it to NABE members as well. So if you'd like a recording to share with your staff, we'll be able to provide that with you too. You may also access the session materials through the NABE website. Elizabeth's presentation is posted now, but we'll be posting additional materials after the session as well. Please join us again in the NABE classroom for our next webinar in January. To register, please make sure to visit the NABE website. Until next time, we will see you in the NABE classroom. Thanks again, Elizabeth. Goodbye.
Thank you.